The air in Dusty Creek was heavy with dust, heat, and the quiet desperation that settled over a town used to scraping by. The wooden platform at the center of town creaked under the weight of expectation and the restless shuffling of boots. Wagons had lined the street hours before, and townsfolk had gathered in clusters, murmuring among themselves as they waited to see which of the young women traveling west might become the newest helpmate, or the newest burden, to some local rancher or merchant. Most of the women had already been claimed, whisked away by men who had a little money, a little land, and a desire for someone to cook, clean, and bear children. By mid-afternoon, only one woman remained on the platform, a lone figure standing beneath the harsh glare of the sun, her hands gripping the faded hem of her dress. She was the last bride, and the silence around her felt heavier than the blazing heat above. Her name was Clara, though few in Dusty Creek knew it, and even fewer would have cared. She had been traveling west for weeks, a journey filled with uncertainty and whispered promises of work and home. When she'd first arrived, she'd imagined that a place like this might offer a fresh start. But reality had been far colder. She had been passed over repeatedly, left standing awkwardly while other women were claimed. Each rejection had chipped away at her hope, leaving her raw and vulnerable. Her bonnet shaded her face, but it could not hide the storm in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way her knuckles were white from gripping her skirts. She refused to cry, not yet. Crying here would mark her as fragile, something to discard. The auctioneer's voice cut through the air, raspy and insistent, trying to sell a story that made the situation sound almost ordinary. Step right up, gentlemen. She may not be the prettiest, but she's healthy enough. Knows her way around a kitchen, can mend clothes, and can handle a horse if you know what I mean. Do I hear $10? 5, anyone? His words, meant to entice, only reminded Clara of the cold truth. She was being measured, weighed, and given a price. Each syllable stung, but she straightened her back and lifted her chin. If she was to survive, she could not falter now. She scanned the crowd, noting the faces of men with sunburned necks, the lined faces of older ranchers, the young boys who had come to see women as curiosities rather than humans. Most avoided her gaze. Some looked away with a smirk, some whispered to the neighbor, and others simply spat in the dust, indifferent to her presence. She wondered how many of them would recognize what it felt like to stand there, exposed, being auctioned like cattle. She wondered how many had ever been so thoroughly discarded. She shivered despite the heat. Then she saw him. He stood at the edge of the gathering, leaning against a post as though the world might crumble around him and he wouldn't even notice. The brim of his hat cast a shadow over his face, but it didn't hide the tension in his shoulders or the way his hands rested lightly on the fence, as though the touch of the wood was the only thing keeping him tethered to life. Jack Callahan. The name carried a quiet weight in the town, though few spoke it aloud. He had once been a respected rancher, a man with broad shoulders, a steady hand, and a kind heart. But tragedy had a way of reshaping a man. Fever had stolen his wife and unborn child, and whiskey had swallowed the remainder of his hope. Townsfolk whispered that he hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, that he had taken to wandering the outskirts of his land, drinking and brooding, a shell of the man he had once been. And yet, as Clara's eyes met his, something shifted. His gaze lingered longer than it should have, and in the quiet, crowded tension of the auction, she felt the brush of recognition, not of familiarity, but of shared loneliness. Broken people often recognized one another. The auctioneer's voice faltered for a moment. Anyone? Do I hear a bid? He cleared his throat, but the words sounded hollow. The crowd shifted impatiently, muttering among themselves. No one raised their hand. No one stepped forward. Clara's stomach knotted. She had been the last left, and now, it seemed, she would leave the platform with nothing. Not even pity. Then she saw Jack's hand move. Slowly, deliberately, almost unwillingly. He didn't call out or cheer. He didn't raise his voice or offer a smile. He simply lifted his hand, and the world seemed to pause. I'll take her, he said, voice low and rough, carrying the weight of both sorrow and something unspoken. The sound of his words cut through the murmur like a shot. Heads turned, eyes widened, some laughed nervously, assuming he was joking, or perhaps making a spectacle. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then quickly regained composure. Sold. To Jack Callahan. The gavel fell with authority, and in an instant, Clara's fate was sealed. Her heart hammered with confusion, disbelief, and a tinge of fear. She hadn't expected this, not him, not now, not like this. He was a man marked by loss, a man whose grief was well known and whispered about. She had no idea why he had chosen her, and the uncertainty was almost unbearable. Yet something in his eyes suggested that his choice was not made lightly. There was no hint of cruelty, no glimmer of mockery. Just a quiet, stubborn resolve that startled her. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, some whispering about how foolish he must be, and some pitying the woman who had been sold to a broken cowboy. Clara gathered her bundle and stepped off the platform, legs trembling with uncertainty. She followed him instinctively, because she had no choice. She had been claimed, whether she wanted to be or not. Jack didn't speak, didn't glance her way. He simply turned and started down the dusty road, boots crunching against the grit. Clara's mind raced with questions. Why had he chosen her? Was he truly capable of caring for anyone? Could she survive under the same roof with a man whose heart seemed as fractured as her own? She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Fear, uncertainty, and a strange spark of curiosity kept her silent. As they moved away from the town, the whispers of the crowd faded, leaving only the quiet rhythm of hooves and wheels. Clara noticed how Jack's steps were deliberate, almost measured, and how his gaze occasionally drifted to the horizon, as if the world beyond Dusty Creek was more familiar than the people in it. There was a story etched into his every movement, a grief that spoke louder than words. And despite her fear, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe, against all odds, being the last bride left didn't mean she had been abandoned. It meant she had been chosen. She stole a glance at him, standing tall despite the invisible weight he carried, and wondered if perhaps he, too, had been waiting for someone to step into his empty life. Someone to remind him that even broken people could still matter. And in that moment, the barren landscape of Dusty Creek felt a little less lonely, because for the first time in a long while, two lost souls were walking the same road, uncertain of where it would lead, but unwilling to let go of the path they had found together. The trail to Jack's ranch stretched on under a burning orange sky, the kind of sky that made the earth look dry enough to crack underfoot. Clara rode in the wagon behind Jack, her small bundle on her lap, feeling the uneven jostle of the wheels and the weight of every stare she imagined he might cast her way. But Jack didn't look at her, and that, strangely, was more unsettling than if he had. His broad shoulders moved with steady rhythm, but the tension in his hands gripping the reins suggested a man carrying more than the load of the wagon or the horses he guided. It was a tension she recognized in herself, the kind that came from nights spent trying to sleep through grief, from days spent pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. She wanted to speak, to break the silence that stretched between them like the desert horizon, but the words lodged in her throat. What could she ask? Why had he chosen her? Why had a man so clearly broken decided to tie himself to her, someone he didn't know, someone the world had deemed unwanted? The questions swirled endlessly, and each time she tried to frame them, her courage faltered. She wondered if he even noticed her, or if she was just a burden he had picked up because he didn't know how to say no. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had dipped low enough to paint the landscape in reds and purples. The land itself seemed quiet, almost mournful, the fences sagging and the corral empty. It was a place that had seen better days, a ranch once alive with cattle, with laughter, maybe even children's voices echoing across the fields. Now it seemed as though the earth had held its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to bring it back to life. Clara felt a pang in her chest. This place, abandoned in its own way, mirrored her own journey, stripped bare, carrying only the memory of hopes long past, fragile but not quite gone. Jack pulled the wagon up to the side of the cabin, letting the horses graze on sparse grass near the corral. He didn't speak as he began unloading her belongings, small, worn trunks, a few clothes, a bundle of personal items she had carried across miles of unsettled land. His movements were methodical, careful, as though handling fragile glass rather than worn cloth and leather. Clara followed quietly, hesitant to intrude on the space he had carved out for himself, though every step she took made her feel more vulnerable, more aware of the delicate balance between acceptance and intrusion. The cabin was modest but sturdy, its wooden walls faded from sun and wind, its windows small and curtained. Jack lit a lantern and set it on the table, casting flickering shadows that made the room feel both welcoming and haunted. The scent of the place hit her, stale whiskey, worn leather, and dust, all mingling into an aroma that spoke of solitude. She surveyed the room silently, noting the sparse furniture, the simple bed that would be hers, and the weight of history pressed into every corner. Finally, she found the courage she had been holding in reserve. Why? She asked, her voice soft but steady, breaking the silence like a fragile twig snapping underfoot. Why did you take me? Why me? Jack froze, shoulders stiffening as if the question had physically struck him. For a long moment, he didn't answer. The silence seemed to stretch on forever, each second amplifying the pounding of her heart. Then he turned slightly, just enough for the lamplight to catch the shadowed lines of his face. His eyes were storm gray, tired but searching, and they held the raw honesty of a man who had seen too much lost to lie. Because I know what it's like to be left behind, he said finally, his voice low, hoarse with emotion. Didn't reckon anyone else would step up. Figured maybe two people who've lost near everything might manage to live side by side. The words landed like stones in her chest. Clara swallowed hard, unsure whether to feel gratitude or fear. She had never imagined that someone, like Jack, so closed off, so clearly carrying his own unbearable pain, might understand hers. Her throat burned, but she forced herself to nod slightly, acknowledging the truth she saw in him. It was a truth that transcended words, that sometimes, shared loneliness could be the beginning of something more profound than either person had dared hope for. As night fell, Clara moved quietly through the small cabin, settling her few belongings and trying to make the space her own. She paused by the window, looking out at the stars beginning to pierce the darkness. The land beyond was quiet, vast, and untamed, and it felt both threatening and full of possibility. In that moment, she realized she wasn't entirely afraid. Not of him, not yet. There was a fragile trust forming, built from the shared acknowledgement of pain and the silent promise of survival together. Jack sat outside on the porch, lantern flickering at his side, staring into the horizon. The night wind stirred the grass, and the distant call of a coyote echoed across the empty fields. He thought of the auction, of the moment he had raised his hand, and of the strange, involuntary pull that had made him claim her. He hadn't wanted it, not at first. He had told himself he wanted no ties, no responsibilities, no reminder of what he had lost. But as he watched Clara move inside, the quiet determination in her posture, he realized that something had shifted in him. She had stepped into his life, uninvited, unplanned, and yet somehow necessary. Inside, Clara lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night, the creak of the cabin, and the soft breathing of the man who had chosen her. Her mind wandered through the events of the auction, the sting of rejection, and the unexpected weight of being chosen by someone so broken. She thought of his eyes, gray and distant, yet somehow seeing her in a way no one else had. There was a tenderness there, buried under layers of grief and anger, and she clung to the hope that perhaps this fragile connection could grow into something stronger. Sleep came slowly, uneasy and punctuated by dreams of the auction platform, of hands raised and hands refused, of dusty streets and whispered judgments. Yet even in her dreams, there was a thread of comfort, Jack's hand, his quiet voice, the sense that she was not entirely alone. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to imagine a future where her life wasn't measured by the cold appraisals of strangers, but by the quiet, steady companionship of someone who understood what it was to be lost. When morning came, Clara rose to the soft light spilling through the small windows. She dressed quietly, mindful of the man who still slept in the next room, and stepped outside. The air was cool, a sharp contrast to the heat of the previous day, and the ranch, though battered and silent, felt alive in the morning light. She breathed deeply, feeling the weight of her past begin to lift just a little. Jack emerged from the cabin shortly after, carrying a bucket of water, and she noticed the way his movements were careful, deliberate, almost as if he was testing himself to see if he still had purpose. Neither spoke immediately. Words were unnecessary. Their shared silence was an understanding, a mutual recognition of wounds and the tentative beginnings of healing. Jack handed her a cloth to wipe her hands, and their fingers brushed briefly, a spark of connection, brief but undeniable. Clara felt her heart skip a beat, but she didn't look away. For once, she didn't need to. In the quiet of that morning, on a small, battered ranch at the edge of the desert, something shifted. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something stronger than fear. It was survival. It was trust. It was the recognition that sometimes the broken pieces of life could fit together in ways that neither person expected, creating something stronger than the sum of its parts. And as they worked side by side, preparing the ranch for what the day would bring, both Clara and Jack felt it, the fragile, flickering hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this unexpected union could be the beginning of their redemption.